Hi, welcome back. I'm John Ruppel. I'm a faculty member here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law and the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and the Environment. And it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Liebman today. Matt is the Henry A. Wallace Endowed Chair of Sustainable Agriculture at Ohio State University. Before joining Ohio State, Matt worked at the University of Maine for about 11 years. He became a fellow at the American Society of Agronomy in 2009 and was a member of the National Research Council's committee that produced the 2015 report titled A Framework for Assessing Effects of the Food Systems. His research, teaching, and outreach activities focus on ways to improve environmental quality and agricultural productivity while reducing dependence on agrochemicals and fossil fuels. His specific research interests include diversifying cropping systems, weed ecology and management, and the use of native prairie species for biofuel production and soil, water, and wildlife conservation. Matt earned his AB degree in biological sciences from Harvard and his PhD in botany from the University of California-Berkeley. So please join me in welcoming Matt for his presentation, Enhancing Biodiversity in the U.S. Corn Belt to Balance Productivity, Profitability, and Environmental Health. Matt?
Thanks so much. Can you see me now? Yeah, can you see me?
Yes.
Very good. I know that we're all very concerned right now with the COVID-19 virus, and those of you in Utah are working through the after effects of a large earthquake, and I hope everybody is staying strong and able to deal with these challenges. I'm going to share some thoughts with you today that maybe are not quite so immediate in the minds of many of us right now, but I hope that in a period of weeks and months we'll be able to direct some attention on these issues. So I'll put some slides up, we'll work through those, and I think we'll have time for a couple of questions at the end. So I'm at Iowa State University, and in preparation for this talk, I did a little bit of reading. I had read essays by Wallace Stegner before, but I looked more into his personal history, and I think it's worth just a couple of brief comments. It's quite striking to me that he was born in north central Iowa and obtained his graduate degrees from the University of Iowa. After being born in Iowa, Stegner lived in Saskatchewan and Montana, moved south to Utah, and ultimately lived in California and spent summers in northeastern Vermont. But he identified as a Westerner, and in his nonfiction essays, he was quite focused on the role of natural resource management in the West and society in the Western United States. And he was quite attuned to the natural environment. And as shown in this quote here, he identified as a Westerner, but particularly with regard to the landscape, its colors. And as he said here, the endless green of Iowa offended me, which I found kind of interesting. So out here in the Corn Belt, we live in the most photosynthetically active zone on Earth during a period of months during our Northern Hemisphere summer. If you look at remote sensing images from space, they can pick up the electron emissions from photosynthesis, which is the process whereby carbon dioxide is moved into plants. And across the Corn Belt, there's this enormous amount of photosynthetic activity that is greater than what you see in Brazil or Central Africa. So we have this enormous amount of productivity. It's the driver of making the Corn Belt, Iowa in particular, a agricultural powerhouse where we generate something on the order of 2.5 billion bushels of corn, 500 million bushels of soybean, large numbers of cattle, 55 million hogs and pigs, 16 billion eggs, and more than 4 billion gallons of ethanol. So that's an enormous amount of production. And it didn't always used to be this way. And we'll talk a little bit about what the transition from the native prairie did to the environment in just a minute. When Euro-American settlers came to Iowa in the mid-1800s, they found a fertile, biologically diverse environment. Most of it was grassland. If you moved into the riparian areas along streams and rivers, there were trees. And this grassland was a function of repeated fires set by lightning and Native Americans and grazing pressure set by bison, elk, and deer. We had our last glacier move through north central Iowa and southern Minnesota about 12 to 13,000 years ago, and prairie vegetation colonized after that. The deep roots of these plants created very fertile soil. Much of the biomass of these plants was set below ground, and the movement of carbon through roots and exudates into the soil created the black, fertile soils that dominate Iowa and much of the Corn Belt. Starting in the mid-1800s with Euro-American settlement, these fertile soils were transformed for agricultural use. John Deere brought forward the plow in the mid-1800s that was capable of inverting this densely rooted prairie vegetation and turning it over to kill it. And that resulted in a massive transformation of the native ecosystem across the Corn Belt into agricultural land. And Iowa has the smallest percentage of native vegetation remaining after this Euro-American settlement of any state in the country. If you look at what our landscape looks like today, most of the state is dominated by corn and soybean production. 63% of the total land area of Iowa is in just these two crops. And these two crops, corn and soy, dominate 82% of our cropland. This map of Wright County, which is just north of where I am, shows almost 600 square miles dominated by corn in yellow, soy in green, a little bit of forest vegetation along the creek sides, shown in that light green color, a few ponds, a couple of towns, but almost the entire area, well in excess of 63% of this county, is in corn and soy. The other change that's come forward in agriculture here is enormous concentrations of animals. My colleague, Chris Jones at the University of Iowa, has calculated what he calls Iowa's real population on a fecal equivalent basis. That is, if you took the quantity of nutrients excreted by the farm animals we have, Iowa would have the equivalent of 134 million people in a state where there are 3.2 million real human beings, which would make Iowa the 10th most populous country in the world, right below Russia and right above Mexico. So we have enormous numbers of pigs, dairy cattle, beef cattle, chickens that lay eggs, and some turkeys. And that manure is not necessarily well distributed, and as I'll talk about later, contributes to some serious water quality problems. We have continuing problems with soil erosion, water quality degradation via nutrient and pesticide discharge, greater frequency and severity of flooding, herbicide-resistant weeds, new crop diseases, a tremendous amount of economic volatility due to changes in export markets and natural disasters, and reductions of wildlife populations, including monarch butterflies, bees, and other pollinators that are linked to these low agroecosystem diversity issues. Our area is not arid like the West, and it's been the site of an increasing frequency and intensity of high precipitation events. The Global Climate Change Assessment Team in the United States has noted that over the last century, there's a 50% increase in days where we have in excess of 4 inches of rain. And that often occurs when the soil is already saturated from previous rain. And that creates a tremendous possibility for enhanced soil erosion and flooding. Iowa has been the site of very serious flooding events in multiple years. Cedar Rapids, shown here, was the subject of billions of dollars of damage caused by flooding. We had more flooding events in 2010. We have localized flooding events almost every year. Western Iowa was subject to very serious flooding last year. Stream and river flow has been increased as the amount of perennial grassland on the landscape has been replaced by corn, soy, and other seasonal row crops. The ability of land to absorb and slow the movement of rainfall has changed dramatically as the percentage of the landscape dominated by annual row crops has increased. We have other water-related issues. Iowa has 1 million miles of subsurface drainage tile. These are pipes inserted under crop fields that enhance the movement of water out of the soil and into artificially constructed drainage ditches, which discharge water to streams and rivers, many of which are used for drinking water sources. So the movement of nitrogen and other dissolved chemicals out of agricultural land into these surface water channels has created some serious pollution problems. The city of Des Moines has the largest nitrate removal facility in the world. This is a physical and chemical process whereby nitrate is taken out of drinking water by an ion exchange system on resin beads, and water is delivered to 500,000 customers in the Des Moines area. The number of days a year that this system is working can be greatly expanded in seasons with a lot of rainfall and a lot of nitrate removal. The system is being overloaded, and as a consequence of this, we've gotten into very serious social challenges whereby the Des Moines Waterworks sued 3 counties dominated by agriculture upstream of the Raccoon River, and the Des Moines River also contributes to the water system in the city of Des Moines. These systems, the water drainage systems from agricultural land are delivering considerable amounts of nitrogen, and the legal tension has gotten rather high. Iowa is also a major contributor of nitrogen and phosphorus to the Gulf of Mexico, and nutrient enhancement in the Gulf has led to what's called a dead zone, a hypoxic zone, where overloading of nutrients creates increases in algal blooms. When those algae die, their decomposition results in oxygen deficits, which kill all the fish and shellfish in these coastal fishery areas. So it's a continental scale problem. So in the face of these challenges and others, we need to develop solutions. I want to talk about 2 ways that enhanced biodiversity on agricultural land can be used to address these types of environmental challenges. The first example involves the diversification of crop rotations integrated with livestock production, and the second example involves the reintroduction of native perennial prairie vegetation into and around crop fields. The first experiment I'll talk about is at a field location operated by Iowa State University in central Iowa called the Marston Farm. It involves the diversification of a 2-year corn-soybean system. This is the dominant conventional cropping system in our area. That system is heavily reliant on the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. The diversification scheme that I'll talk about today replaces the simple corn-soybean system with a more diverse system that adds oats and alfalfa to create a longer rotation with small grains and perennial forage crops. It reduces the amount of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer used by recycling manure produced from animals fed the diverse set of crops in the longer rotation. This work is conducted, as I mentioned before, at a university research farm. The site is about 22 acres in size. The experiment was initiated in 2001. The plots are 60 by 275 feet each. And it's set up so that each crop within each rotation system is present every year. The work is funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture with competitive grants, by the Iowa Soybean Association, which is a commodity group within the state of Iowa, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, which is now defunct with regard to funding based on a decision made by the Iowa legislature several years ago. The four-year rotation system, as I mentioned before, has seen a large reduction in the use of nitrogen fertilizer, and that's a function of having nitrogen fixed biologically by alfalfa. It's taken out of the air and put into plant roots through a biological process, and some of that nitrogen becomes available to the subsequent corn crop. It's also a function of recycling nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in manure. And that's allowed us large reductions in the amounts of mineral fertilizer used in this system, relative to the two-year system, which operates with an average input of 151 pounds of nitrogen to the corn crop every year that corn is grown. We don't spray the alfalfa and the oat crops, and that's allowed an immediate 50% reduction in the amount of herbicide used. We've also experimented with other herbicide regimes that's allowed us to reduce the amount of herbicide inputs up to 97%. How have we done on yields in this more diverse system with lower inputs of fertilizer and herbicide? We've seen a statistically significant 4 to 5% increase in corn yield when we're using much lower amounts of fertilizer in the four-year system. So we haven't given up anything in yield when we grow corn in the four-year system. We're also seeing a big increase, 15 to 20% increase in the yield of soybean in the four-year rotation, the more diverse rotation relative to the two-year system. I'll talk more in a few minutes about why this is true, but it's related to reductions in the frequency, the intensity of disease caused by a soil-borne pathogen. Our oat yields are above the state average, and our alfalfa yields are slightly above the state average. What about economic performance? The four-year system has seen a slight reduction in gross returns, in part because oat and alfalfa are worth less than corn and soybean on the market. However, the costs of production of oat and alfalfa are lower than they are for corn and soybeans. So our production costs for the whole rotation are lower for the four-year system than the two-year system. And consequently, there's no statistical difference in net returns to land and management between the four-year system and the two-year system. You can see the difference in returns here, crop by crop. We make less money in oats and alfalfa. We make more money when we grow corn and soybean because our yields are higher and our expenses are lower. And again, the average rotation returns to land and management don't differ between the 4-year system and the 2-year system, although they're numerically a bit higher for the 4-year system. What about soil health and other environmental indicators? Well, physical structure of the soil is improved by use of the longer rotations. When you look at the resistance to root penetration down to a depth of 45 centimeters, there's less resistance to the soil penetration by roots in the longer 4-year rotation. It's softer, it has more airspace, and roots can have access to deeper soil layers where water and nitrogen can enhance crop productivity. Earthworm abundance is 71% greater in the 4-year rotation relative to the 2-year rotation, in part because we're adding high-quality residues and some manure back to the system, and that serves to enhance the abundance of the earthworms that promote nutrient cycling and improved soil structure. Other soil quality indicators are greater in the 4-year system than the 2-year system. Particulate organic matter, which is the fraction of total organic matter that responds most quickly to additions of organic amendments like crop residues and manure, and reductions in tillage intensity due to the presence of perennial forage crops like alfalfa, is enhanced. The so-called POM fraction, the particulate organic matter fraction of organic matter, is really important for enhanced soil physical structure and for enhanced nutrient cycling. Microbial biomass carbon, which is a function of having more rapidly accessible organic matter amendments for microbial activity, is enhanced greatly by the use of the 4-year rotation. And potentially mineralizable nitrogen, which is an indicator of the amount of nitrogen that can be derived for crop use from soil organic matter, is also greater in the 4-year rotation. So these indicators of soil functional characteristics are improved by use of the longer rotation. I mentioned before that soybean yields are enhanced in the longer rotation. We've conducted plant pathology investigations that show that the root infection by this pathogen, Fusarium virgiliforme, which lives in the soil, is altered by the presence of the 4-year rotation. This fungus rots the roots of soybean, injects a toxin into the roots that move to the leaves of soybean, and can cause severe yield loss of this crop in cooler, wet weather. We saw a large reduction in the disease between 2010 and 2015. The incidence is the number of plants of the crop that are affected. You can see a 94% reduction. Severity is of the plants that are affected by the pathogen, how many shows damage, and you can see almost a 70% reduction in the severity of the disease. And these reductions in incidence and severity were linked to a reduction of the disease and an increase in the yield in the longer rotation. Soil sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus discharges are reduced by the use of the longer rotation. In this SWOT model evaluation, we see a 60% reduction in soil sediment discharge. We see a 40% reduction in runoff of nitrogen and a 33% reduction in runoff of phosphorus due to the use of the 4-year rotation. When we look at concentrations of nitrate nitrogen in water samples collected under each cropping system, we see large reductions in nitrate nitrogen concentrations in corn due to the use of the 4-year system, and where we have the small grain crop oat and alfalfa, we see large reductions in the amount of nitrate nitrogen concentrations in water collected beneath the plots that would be moving to drainage water and ultimately to drinking water sources. So the use of the longer rotations reduces the amount of nitrate available for leaching and contamination of drinking water sources. When we look at fossil fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions from the 4-year rotation relative to the 2-year rotation, there's 64% reductions in energy consumption due to the use of less fertilizer, less tractor fuel, and less natural gas for grain drying. And in the process, we're also emitting fewer greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. So this is important with regard to climate functions. Overall, we would say increasing cropping system diversity can balance productivity, profitability, and environmental health. We have over 30 publications, technical publications, that describe these impacts of this diversified system. If you're interested, please contact me and I can provide you with a list of references. The second study I want to talk about briefly is called the Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. This involves a strategic conversion of land from row crops to prairie vegetation. Prairie vegetation has certain advantages with regard to soil, water, and nature conservation. It provides perennial cover, which is important for reducing erosion. It has deep roots, which also hold onto soil, but also add carbon below ground. It's diverse and can support a diverse community of plants and animals. It's native, so it grows well under our local soil and climate conditions. And these stiff stems that prairie plants generate stay erect in a pounding rain and reduce runoff of water and soil sediment. The experiment I want to talk about started originally in the mid-2000s at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, just east of the city of Des Moines in Jasper County, near Prairie City, Iowa. It involved 12 experimental watersheds, each 1 to 8 acres each, with a 6 to 10% slope. You can see one of those watersheds here with prairie vegetation distributed at the bottom, mid-slope, and upper slope positions perpendicular to the flow of water down the slope, and water moving out of these catchments was trapped and monitored by what's called an H-flume, which assesses the quantity of water flowing out of the catchment and samples the amount of sediment and nutrients in the water flowing out of the bottom of the catchment. That's that structure at the bottom of the slide. What we saw in a 8-year period that was recounted in a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017 was that conversion of 10% of the cropland area in these catchments to prairie vegetation reduced runoff 37%, reduced nitrogen in surface runoff 70%, reduced nitrate nitrogen in the concentrations of water beneath the soil 72%, reduced phosphorus losses in surface runoff 77%, reduced soil loss out of the bottom of these catchments 95%, increased by 2-fold bird abundance, increased by 3-fold pollinator abundance. And when we compared the use of these prairie strips to the construction of terraces for soil conservation, they're much cheaper, and the cost is comparable to cover crops. The second phase of this strips project has involved working with landowners throughout Iowa and the Corn Belt to implement these prairie strips on their land. We now have over 66 farmer collaborators who have planted 576 acres of prairie on 4,930 cropland acres. Here you can see strips planted on the contour in Tama County, Iowa, interwoven with cropland. And as water flows down that slope, it's intercepted by the prairie strips, and it reduces the amount of runoff, increases habitat for native birds, pollinators, and other species. Here's a flatland area where the landscape is dominated by crops and wildlife habitat is hard to come by. And you can see prairie strips interspersed with cropland on a flatter area. Often we can identify lower producing areas of crop fields where the cost of production is often not met by the agricultural output due to prior history of erosion or seasonal flooding, and these areas are well suited for replacing cropland by prairie strips. We've done a substantial outreach effort working with cooperating farmers to share their information and experience with other farmers. And you can see a graduate student here on a farm field day describing the use of prairie strips on this farm in Northwest Iowa and allowing other farmers and land managers to get the benefit of our cooperators' experience. The use of prairie strips has now been recognized by over 50% of the farmers contacted in the Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll conducted annually by my colleague Jay Arbuckle in the Department of Sociology at Iowa State, with over 1,000 responses. It's clear that the word is getting out about the use of these prairie strips for soil, water, and nature conservation. I want to finish by talking about 3 paths to changes in land use and shifts in farming practices that we've identified through our experiences in Iowa. One of them is government policy. A second is market pull. And the third is farmer-to-farmer information exchange. It's important to recognize that the federal government is very strongly involved in what happens in agricultural areas with regard to land use and farming practices. Iowa is the #2 recipient of farm payments for commodity subsidies, crop insurance subsidies, conservation, and disaster payments. And you can see that annually between 1995 through 2019, the federal government dispersed almost $16 billion to farm owners, farm operators, for commodities, insurance, conservation, and disaster payments. In Iowa, we receive, on average, more than $1 billion a year, which translates to more than $10 million per county in Iowa. So it's not that there's no money in Iowa for farming. The federal government, through your tax dollars, disperses a very large amount of money into our rural communities. Over a period of time, as we developed information about prairie strips, we shared that information with federal policymakers, and in the last iteration of the federal farm bill, called the Agriculture Improvement Act of 2019, farmers can now get paid through the Conservation Reserve Program, conservation title, for implementing prairie strips on their land. So through the use of science experiments, we developed the information base, we shared it with policymakers, and through the policy instrument of the Farm Bill, farmers can now get paid to put land into prairie strips and other conservation practices through the Conservation Reserve Program and get paid a yearly fee for that conservation practice. I mentioned before that market pull is another mechanism for increasing the use of conservation practices and changes in cropping systems. US consumers put about $1.4 trillion per year into the food value chain in their purchases of food and beverages, and about 2/3 of that accrues to processors, distributors, and retailers. Those people in the food value chain can signal to farmers how they would like their commodities and food products to be produced. And we're seeing a certain number of food processors, distributors, and retailers, such as General Mills and others, starting to develop new value chains for food products from the farm to the consumer. And this may involve a differentiation of the food product such that the consumer can identify that it's been produced in a manner that's more environmentally friendly or better supports conservation practices on the farm and may pass a greater share of the food dollar up to the farmer for these differentiated products and practices. Finally, for farmers to make changes, it's important for them to have confidence that the changes they make, such as adopting the production of oats where they've just grown corn and soybean in the past, is potentially profitable, has a market, and will work to their advantage. And the best way for farmers to develop confidence in doing this is to hear about it from other farmers and for processors, distributors, and retailers to share their interests in developing new market channels with the farmers. So we've been involved in work with Practical Farmers of Iowa, Grain Millers Incorporated, and other members of the food value chain and the farmer-to-farmer research and extension network to share this information. So with that, I'll stop here and take a question or two. I thank you very much for your interest in this work, and I hope that under less trying circumstances, we can focus our attention on these types of changes in the food and agriculture system. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. That was fascinating. I really appreciate your comments, and it's encouraging right now, you know, at this time to think that farmers can do well economically by doing good environmentally when they transition to this four-crop rotation system. I'm wondering what this means for water usage, though. Can you talk a little bit about irrigation and what the impacts are on irrigation water usage in making that transition?
So here in Iowa, it's very uncommon to use irrigation. We have a few areas of the state on sandy soils, but essentially all of our production is rain-fed. And that's true throughout much of the Corn Belt. As you move west through Nebraska, you begin to move into areas where irrigation is more common. It will change the adoption of cropping practices when we take into account water use efficiency. But as we develop soil health and soil quality through some of these cropping practices, water use efficiency can actually be increased. In a drought year here, we found that the amount of water stored for corn production was 14 to 20% greater in the soil in the longer rotation than in the soil underneath corn in the 2-year rotation. So there can be increases in water use efficiency even in rain-fed systems.
Thanks. 2 more quick questions. I'm wondering if we look at a large-scale change in the distribution and composition of crops that are being produced by switching to a 4-crop rotation, what does that mean for consumers? How does that change ripple through the agricultural system, what does that mean for either people or livestock that would be consuming those different products?
That's an excellent question, and I'll answer it in two parts. The first is something between 5 and 15% of our agricultural acres in Iowa are not making back the costs of production. In other words, the money that people spend on fertilizers, seed, pesticides, field operations for corn and soy production on about 5 to 15% of their cropland is not sufficiently repaid by the quantity of crops they're harvesting off of those acres. So by planting less, they can actually make more money because they'll be spending less money on acres that are not generating enough crop material to pay back the costs of production. So part of these changes can be accomplished by precision agriculture techniques that identify within fields low producing areas that don't merit the costs of inputs. So that works to the farmer's benefit by decreasing expenses across the field and focusing expenses on those areas that are most likely to be productive and profitable. The second aspect of my answer is that analyses conducted by economists at the Union of Concerned Scientists show that between 20 and 40% of the current corn and soy acreage within Iowa could be shifted to other crops like small grains, oats, barley, wheat, and forage crops like alfalfa without influencing the supply and demand relationships that would have a large impact on the prices that farmers can receive in the marketplace. So there is still enough flexibility within the marketing system itself to absorb shifts on a, let's say, 20 to 40% of our acreage basis without severely disrupting prices that farmers receive now. And as you know already, farmers are receiving very low prices due to fluctuations in export markets. So the opportunities for shifts in crop production may be directly beneficial to farmers when they're able to market more of these crops through locally produced livestock in ways that enhance soil and water conservation.
Great. Final question. Matt, if you were king for the day, what would you suggest as several policy changes that would promote the transition to a more sustainable agricultural and food system?
Well, as I mentioned before, it's not that we have no money to spend in the agricultural sector. It's a question of what we spend it for. So right now, if you look over the last 20 years, most of our funding for agriculture has gone into commodity support and subsidized insurance payments rather than into conservation. We can shift that balance and we can enhance the amount of money going into the conservation sector of farm payments rather than into subsidized insurance and into subsidized commodity production. So I would say the first thing we can do is try to expand the amount of money in the conservation area of the Farm Bill and allow farmers to support more of their operation through greater amounts of conservation and production of alternative crops through integrated crop livestock systems and diversified rotations.
Great, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us and your flexibility in responding to rapid changes in these difficult times. Thank you very much, Matt.
Yeah, I hope everybody stays strong and healthy. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thank you.